great to have you here. People will be filtering in, and that's just fine. But we're going to begin our forum. So plenty of chairs up here and a chance to engage in conversation. I'm Pastor Vern Christopherson, in case you were wondering, but I'm guessing most all of you knew that. But good to be a part of this conversation with you. I'd like to sit there and say that I'm an expert when it comes to race, but I think a lot of us are figuring things out as we go. I'm not an expert at all. I happened to pick up a book a while ago. The Synod was recommending that we read a book called Waking Up White by Debbie Irving. Anybody heard of that? Waking Up White? Our Synod Vice President has. That's very good. Jim Martinson has, so good for you. Yeah, certainly with your time we're going to be talking a little bit about that book and her personal journey today, but we're going to talk about our own journey because it's a journey for all of us along the way. And I think it's really easy to feel like we should know more, or that we should be better people, or building bridges should be easy when it comes to race. And I don't think those things are necessarily true at all. I'm reading a book right now also called American Nations, and it's, I don't know if you've heard of that, but it's a story about 11, it's called, the subtitle, A History of 11 Rival Regional Cultures of North America. You know, we think the Pilgrims got here and the Puritans showed up and everything was just kind of hunky-dory. And that book talks about all the different groups that came from all the different places and all the different races that were part of that, and how much that rivalry has been a part of our history too. And of course, some of those people came and they believed very strongly in having slaves, and others didn't. And there was lots of things to work out from the very beginning. So it's a big wonder sometimes that we get along as well as we do, but it doesn't seem like we're getting along all that well at all some of these days. So lots of things to talk about. I think in terms of getting into this conversation on race, I just want to set just a few little ground rules, if you could be so bold. And one of those would be to don't worry about what you're saying. You know, just say things. Tell your story. It's your story. Certainly we want to use I language as much as possible. I think this, I've been exposed to this, I had this experience along the way. But tell the story from your perspective as honestly as you can, and we'll talk about it together. I also think that a part of race conversations involves discomfort. So don't be afraid to be uncomfortable from time to time. That's okay. It really is okay. We don't want to purposely offend each other, but I think realizing that there's going to be some discomfort along the way is a part of the story. Debbie Irving, like I mentioned, wrote the book Waking Up White. I recommend it. It's in the church library. It's certainly worth your time. It's her own personal story. It's her autobiography, if you will, of going down this journey. She grew up in Winchester, Massachusetts, small suburb about 8 miles north of Boston, and she never really thought of herself as white. Now maybe that sounds simplistic, but how many of you have thought of yourself as white? I don't really think about that at all when I wake up in the morning, but I am white. I have a race and I have a culture that has influenced me all along the way. And so has Debbie Irving along the way. She eventually got married, and she moved to another suburb of Boston, Cambridge, which is a more racially mixed suburb. That was intentional, more diversity there. And that waking up was not necessarily being born as a white person, but the self-awareness that came over time as she lived with her whiteness and became more aware of how sometimes it might build more walls than bridges in our relationships with each other. So it was her waking up experience, maybe not unlike Nicodemus' story today, and waking up to a new reality in her life. And it wasn't all going to be easy by any means. As part of our conversations today, we'll have just a little time to find somebody comfortable close by and have a few little short conversations about your own journey along the way, and we hope we can find some time to share those too. Today, Debbie Irving is a racial justice educator and writer. So she's come that far, and she's now telling her own story, but I think she'd be the first to say she's still learning, and it's still a process for her along the way. Well, you know, I've told the story before about growing up in rural South Dakota, and my favorite TV show, of course, was Leave It to Beaver. And I'm proud of that. I remember in 1968, I was 13 years old when Martin Luther King was shot. I bet you remember that too, don't you? Yeah. But I don't know if my TV was really showing those stories, and I suppose I knew he was black. But I wouldn't pay much attention. I don't know how much I cared about that issue back in those days. I've also shared before that I don't think I ever met a black person in person until I was in college. And I think I've told the story before about a pickup basketball game when we were playing shirts and skins in the Concordia College auditorium, and I had taken my shirt off. I was a skin, and another player, a person from Africa who happened to be black, put on my jersey and wore it while I was a skin. And when the time came for the game to be done and put our jerseys on and go home, I didn't want to put my jersey back on. I thought it might rub off on me. And it's amazing what a profound moment that was. And maybe you've had stories like that too in your life. I want you to find a person next to you right now and have a couple-minute conversation about what are some of your first memories of racial differences in our country. Find somebody close to you. 1, 2, 3, go.
Hey, Dan. For me, that's an easy one. Maybe well, becoming aware of something, but it wasn't until we took it to the floor that I could actually see. We toured some way down the road. We toured some of the areas like drive around and see some of these and I remember kind of looking at my hands in the dark and
No, this thing adapts. If you look, even though, yeah, but see how well that adapts? Even though his face is in the dark and the jacket is dark. I mean, there's detail in the faces. And I can swing over and it'll adjust. See that? No, it's fine.
All right, let me call you back.
Yeah, we're good. Yeah, thank you.
Somebody got a story that they want to share? If so, I would invite you to raise your hand. We have, Mike, do you have one of the microphones? Noel Peterson wants to talk. There we go. Mike? There you go. Okay, we got it.
Can't get it out of his hand, you know. We were talking about it. Growing up has a lot to do with what your early experiences are. Grew up on an Iowa farm, and as well you can imagine it was Scandinavians and Germans, and that was about it. Except the person who owned the farm and then had a tenant farm around it, but the person who owned the farm immediately south of us was an African-American family practitioner
Wow.
And so I grew up looking, the only person I knew at that time. So African Americans clearly were professionals, and they were well educated, and they were wealthy. They could own a farm, and then they would go off and work too. Well, that kind of starts it out. Then all of a sudden, as you get older, you find out there's some pretty nasty African Americans, just like there's some pretty nasty white people, but your attitude has changed so much by what you grew up.
What you grew up. Good. Somebody else? Yeah, Jim.
So I'm actually the only white person in my family, and it's been an education for me because my children are continuously raising my consciousness. A few years ago, my youngest son got out of college, for a few years saved up his money, and actually paid for a nice used BMW. Didn't get a loan, paid for it straight up. And then about a year ago, he was driving in Minneapolis and was pulled over by a police officer. And the police officer said to him, "Do you own this car?" Jeff handed him his license, all of the registration, everything was, the face matched up, all the registration matched up. And the police officer looked at him again and said, "Do you own this car?" Now that does not happen if you're white. It just does not happen. I don't want to leave the impression that my family has been deeply discriminated against. They haven't. But it does raise an awareness to me of the fact that we live in, there are things that we assume, we talk about white privilege. One of our white privileges is that we can assume that when we go out on the road, that does not happen. I said to Jeff, I said, "What's your plan?" And before I could finish, he said, "Dad, I have a plan for when I get pulled over, so that nothing really terrible happens." Okay. That's a solitary incident for Jeff, but for his roommate, Jose, that is a way of life. Jose's been detained, for example, for the crime of moving some furniture into their apartment while not being white. And Jose's used to it, and he has a plan to just keep it cool, not escalate the situation. But we live in a different world than our minority brothers and sisters.
And we have no idea what that world is until you've experienced it firsthand, I think. Maybe time for one more? One or two more? Yes, right here, Nancy.
Some years ago, when I was working, I had hired a new law clerk to work for me that year. She grew up in the Deep South and in poverty. She was black. She was brilliant. She spoke in the dialect of the southern black community. Her husband came here for a residency, so she got a job working in the courts. She was trying to call to find an apartment in Rochester. She called many places, and she was told on the phone, they had no openings. It finally dawned on her that perhaps it was her accent that identified her as black. So her husband made some calls. They got an apartment very soon at one place that formerly had been filled.
Wow. Yeah, I think that's a pretty common story. Again, we don't feel that until we experience it, perhaps with somebody close by. We're going to race on. Lots to cover today. So let's have a little truth-telling here. Somewhere along the way, I don't think we were born with stereotypes, right? Will you agree with me on that? But we've been taught certain things along the way. So just for fun, and I'm not trying to get you to sound racist, but you might as you answer this. So what were some of the stereotypes you learned about the Irish growing up? Drinking, okay. Sorry to all you Irish people out there. But drinking. Mexicans. Lazy.
Hardworking.
Hardworking. Well, we got to yes, you get both. You get both. Yeah. And of course, there's slurs along the way. There are wetbacks, right? We hear that along the way. So, Japanese. Smart. What's that? Diabolical. My father-in-law to this day, bless his heart, but he always calls them Japs. Calls them Japs because he lived through World War II, he fought in the Korean War, but he always calls them Japs. Diabolical, yeah. How about Native Americans or Indians? Okay, the only good Indian is a dead Indian. We laugh at that or kind of snicker, but it got said. And sometimes today it still gets said. And then finally, blacks. It's a little harder, right? Say it again.
Good at athletics.
Athletic, yes, very athletic.
Not as good in school.
Not as good in school, but very athletic. Okay. We live with those stereotypes still today. Let's go on a little bit further, and we've been talking about this, I think, by extension, but the American dream is part of our culture, right? So give me a few words to describe the American dream. A phrase or two. Yep.
It seems to me the American dream feels very good about taking the most qualified, the best educated, the most skilled people from other countries and take them as an asset to us.
Okay. So that's an extension of the American dream, to take the most qualified, the best educated, and assimilate them into our culture for opportunities along the way. Yep.
If you work hard and are persistent, you can succeed.
If you work hard and are persistent, you can succeed. Yes?
Home ownership.
Home ownership, absolutely part of the American dream. A good job, right? A good job, home ownership.
Education.
Say it again. Education, get a good education, and you can do anything. I mean, anybody can grow up to be president. Okay, we're not going to go there. But that's what we say, right? We've heard that growing up, and we're not going to go there. All right, we're not. But that's the American dream. And so in your small group, ask this question: how might things have been different if you were white? I'll give you about a minute and a half. 1, 2, 3. If you were white, how might things have been different? Well, no. Let's just keep it. All right. Well, I want to ask the question now. How might things be different for someone who is white versus someone who is not? Okay. We can talk about both ends of that, but I just want you to realize that most of you are white here. And I want you to just name some of those things. So spend a couple minutes naming some of the things about how things might have been different for you along the way.
There's a really interesting thing on Facebook. And she starts asking questions.
Don't listen to Bob.
All the way. You've never had to worry about where your next meal is going. All the way. And with all the breakfast, how much easier it is to make progress. And there were some other questions like that. Very few students step forward for any of those questions. A whole bunch of them. These 10 questions. But you know, how many or when there was 2 parents, and a couple of the students at college are mostly
It's easy to go out. I saw a lot of research. Very little home ownership. A lot of your dreams.
Were you at an academic?
I was at Henry Ford Hospital before you were
I don't know, the 30 seconds. All right, let me call you back.
Immediately we say, you must be calling him
India, Pakistan, and we see
Lots of different stories. And most of us in this room are whites, but we have people of color in this room and a variety of traditions in this room. So you can certainly tell this story from your perspective. How might this story, the American Dream story, be different if you were white versus somebody that was not white? Tell me a few answers to your questions, to that question.
Easier for jobs.
Easier for jobs, definitely.
I was in a high school that was 15% black, and it was the school that always had the most national merit semifinalists, and I was sharing with my friends here that there was a star athlete, and she was black, and I was talking to her in the locker room, and I said, you know, you're such a great athlete. Aren't you glad you're here? Because we talked about education and opportunity, and I thought, well, you're in the best high school in Minneapolis. My dad was the principal, so we knew it was the best high school in Minneapolis. But she said to me, no, I don't want to be here. And I said, why don't you want to be here? And she said, I want to be at Central. And I said, you know, why? I was sort of pressing her a little bit, and she said, because I would be in the majority.
Okay. Is that a Washburn?
Yeah.
South Minneapolis? Yes. Colin?
Okay, that works. So I think growing up for me, I don't really know what the American Dream thing is.
Okay. You don't know the American Dream?
No, because for me, I think it's work ethics was one of the things that you just have to do it, you learn it. It's the only way you could be successful. But I never saw myself as a minority because I don't see color as a defining moment for me. What I know is that I'm created in the image of God, and if people want to see that image in me, that's fine. So yeah, it is really, really hard for jobs and stuff for black people. But for me, I'm applying for a job, and I always tell myself, submitting an application for a job does not mean you have that job. It's not a guarantee.
Mm-hmm.
But when you meet with some, especially here in Olmsted County, I mean, it's bad here when the HR director tells you, we just don't know where the black people are. You know, now I'm like, I didn't know you guys were looking for black people. So it takes a lot of education because in this society, some of us, even though we say, oh, I am the most diverse person, I'm the most cultural competent person you will ever meet, that mindset is hard to change.
It's just in there, isn't it? So thank you for sharing that, Carlo. I appreciate your honesty. Anybody else? Maybe time for one more. Joyce, back there in the red.
I became a middle school English teacher when late 60s and into the early 70s, and I was going to save the world and fix everything with the racial diversity and all of the civil rights movement by education. And I discovered how hard it was when I was in a school that was 50% black, 50% white, to be a white teacher and to get to understand what they were going through. And there was so much anger in the black community at that time. It was tough for me to do what I would hoped I'd do, and that is save the world through my wonderful English teaching. But it was just tough being white and trying to relate to the black community as much as I wanted to do that.
Thank you for telling that story. It's a reminder of that how much work has been done and how much there is still to do. And you did some things, you tried some things, so bless you. We got one time, Bob Howell way in the back. We want to hear from the back too.
No one can hear you. Wait for the mic.
When we went to college, all of the minorities were all scholarship. They were getting a free education. I know because I talked to them about it. So that was a little different from my experience.
Okay. Yeah, and then you begin to use language like entitlement, don't we, sometimes? Hold on to that thought, because if we get a second, we'll talk about that as well. I want to go on to when I was in South Minneapolis. I served a church at 53rd and 10th in South Minneapolis. a relatively nice part of town, other than the planes flying right over the head of the church. And so not everybody wanted to buy homes there. It was noisy. But we moved to Bloomington because, I don't know, call it what you will. A call from God, of course. But our kids were getting to be kind of that late elementary school, early junior high, and so many of the parents were taking their kids and going to the suburbs. They were looking for Joyce to be their teacher. And you were looking for a good opportunity, and we didn't have a lot of kids in our church in that age level. So I ended up taking a call to Bloomington, and probably about 6 weeks after we got there, the youth group came up with a set of t-shirts, and everybody got their own kind of name on their t-shirts, and my son got one that said, Ghetto Boy. So what do you think people were saying when they gave him a t-shirt that said ghetto? Now again, these are high school kids having fun with each other, right? But they called him Ghetto Boy. And it's like, I didn't even know what to think as a pastor. What do you think? What were they saying? Came from the inner city. Yeah, that's the ghetto. We've heard about the inner city. It's the ghetto.
How did he think about? What did he?
Well, I don't know. That's a good question. I'll have to ask him that sometime. He is my son. He's 34 years old. He could probably answer. He's a philosophy major, but I don't know if I asked him that lately. That's a good question, Betty. What else? What were they saying? What do you think? He's an outsider. Yeah. It's dangerous. The city's dangerous. We don't go there all that much. That's where Central High School is. It doesn't exist anymore, but that's where Central used to exist. And does it exist? I can't remember if it exists or not. No, it doesn't anymore. So those kind of places can be dangerous. Yeah. Crime, absolutely crime. We lived in a perfectly nice part of South Minneapolis, but those are the kind of things that go through people's mind.
And stay in your place.
Say it again?
Stay in your place.
Stay in your place, yeah. I think he ended up having a perfectly fine time in that church, and there were more kids there were more kids my kids' ages, so that part worked out well. But there was always that tension, stay in your place. You've come from the city, and we didn't move, we stayed in the city, still live there, been there almost 30 years now. And, but yeah, that's part of what we live in. I'm guessing that as a part of your journey, you have found yourself in some uncomfortable situations. When I was serving in South Minneapolis, I worked with a pastor who was African American. Eleanor Huntsberger was her name, delightful person, had a good relationship together. She happened to be, like I said, African American, and her father died, and so I went to the funeral for Eleanor's dad, and it was in North Minneapolis, probably 350 people there, and guess how many white people were there? Me. I was the only one, and I think more profoundly than at any time in my life, I was in an uncomfortable situation where I realized I'm not one of them. That's what it felt like. So here's my question to you. So do you suppose I stayed for lunch afterward? What do you think?
I hope so.
I'd like to say yes, but I did not. So thank you, Jim, for having confidence in me. But I didn't stay. Didn't know if I felt comfortable, and I didn't stay. I went on my way. I'm sure I came up with an excuse. I'm too busy. But I think I was too uncomfortable, really, to stay. Maybe wasn't sure what I was going to say to these people that didn't necessarily think like me. Barb? Or look like
Well,
me.
talking about church takes me back when I was probably middle school or junior high. Our pastor brought in a family, a black family, to our church services. They sat in the back row. But he was bold, he brought them in there, and there they were.
And what was the intention, do you think?
Well,
They just happened to join the
No.
church, you mean?
I don't think I'm not sure that they joined, but he would go to a black nursing home twice a month after his Sunday services at our church. They were all black.
And he would go to this black nursing home and have a service.
Good for him.
But anyhow, yeah, but they came, I mean, not every Sunday, but they were always in the back row.
Okay.
And that was
Thank
back
you.
in the 50s.
I want to go on to the next question, and I think friendship across racial lines is one of those things that is a possibility. Perhaps it's a coworker, perhaps it's a neighbor down the way, perhaps it's just someone that is a part of your life for whatever reason. So talk at your group for a couple of minutes. What are some of the challenges about forming a friendship across racial lines? I'll give you a couple minutes. 1, 2, 3, go.
Acceptance.
Several subjects as African American. Student medical schools, one of which was a guy named Vern. And actually, what I knew about medical school he's still working in Arizona. So maybe it's been a number of years now. But it was not quite marrying. We had dinner in their home. And I really never, I was kind of close he was just a really smart, was a former staffer for and undersecretary of labor for one Republican.
I'm listening.
I worked in Detroit for 29 years at Henry Ford Hospital. 85% African American in the city.
Yeah.
And it was, I started there 7 years after the big riots there, where the National Guard came in and tanks and everything at the hospital in the neighborhood. And when I joined there, I was a director of the laboratory. 25, 30 about half of them was African American.
30 seconds.
And they're part of us. They were part of that culture that was able to succeed. And we became pretty good friends. Went to a party at one of their houses one time. Went to the funeral of one of the people's sons who was murdered.
Did you stay for long?
I didn't actually. No, but it was a very interesting funeral. Totally different African American black Baptist.
All right, let me call you back.
Oh, you really had experiences there.
Yeah.
By the way, just a reminder that these are conversations that could go on and probably should go on for a long time because we are a congregation that works to build bridges of understanding with people. So this is important stuff. This is where the rubber hits the road. And also, I think I volunteered to be a part of this because two things. They had a forum opening for today, so I said, I'll step in. But also because we're having a community potluck tonight, and we wanted to, should we say, warm up? Because sometimes we're eating tater tot hot dish across the table from someone that doesn't look or think like us. And so how might that be different? And what kind of commonality will we find at that table too? So that's part of why I'm here today. So talk to me. What are some of the challenges in forming friendships across racial lines? Anybody? Raise your hand. Jim? Or no?
Cole brought something very good, kind of the difference between African-born folk and African Americans that are here. Again, for us, I think personally, the ones that are easier to have conversations with are for our friends who are African-born. Their goals are very, very similar. I mean, it's hard to tell much difference.
Yeah.
So there is a difference.
Yeah, okay. All right. Jim?
So one thing that I've been tried to be more conscious of is supporting black businesses, supporting minority businesses, supporting people who are out there, if I get a cab, I'll leave an extra tip for a person of a minority race. And I became aware that there's this black barber shop off 37th Street named Adrian's. And I thought, you know, next time I need my haircut, I'm going to go to this black barber shop. And I didn't know like, is that like treading on their turf? You know, I didn't know. But I went in, and it's been such an enriching, this little tiny facet of my life has been a deeply enriching experience because, I mean, first of all, you know, you go to cost cutters and people have their noses in their magazines, look, you know, waiting their turn.
Not the same.
No. It's, I mean, it's a party. I mean, they got the game on, everybody's having a good time. But it's also been a very profound experience. The young man who runs the thing, it actually turned out to be a friend of my son. I didn't know that before I went in. And he's, to put it mildly, had some rough patches in his life, but now he has this very successful business. And the last time I went in, the guy who was cutting my hair said, you know, Alex really saved our lives.
Wow. Wow.
So.
Okay, a couple more comments for what are some of the challenges. Yes, Rick, back there.
Pastor, I have a hard time making comments in a few moments, but sometime when you have an hour, I'd be happy to discuss.
Sure.
My first reaction, I really had difficulty talking about black and white, particularly white privilege versus black disadvantages. We really have a culture issue. And there's certain cultures that show up, work hard, take advantage of the opportunities in front of them, and there's cultures that don't, and that runs across black,
It's a lot deeper
white,
than color.
and all.
Yeah.
Personal experience, IBM, we had a very strong initiative to hire black minorities. We couldn't find qualified people. We finally gave up and focused on women, and we had great success. I have taught at Southern, not taught, I was invited as a guest lecturer and a consultant to Southern University in New Orleans. Predominantly a black university. I'm basically the only white person in the crowd. Didn't bother me a bit, and I was pleased to be there because I was culturally compatible. As you know, we've lived and worked in Thailand. The only white person in the room, again, felt very comfortable. Last many years, I forget how many right now, we've worked with Chinese, and I'm impressed. There's a culture there. There's a culture in Thailand, which we should admire and model. It has nothing to do with the color, but it has to do with the culture. We worked with young people here in Rochester, a great program at one of the schools, which was boys count. That isn't exactly the name, but the objective was to get boys more engaged. We were somewhat of a sponsor, invited down to observe how it was going, and it was in the school here in Rochester where it had the major number of minorities, and of the kids that showed up, there was one Chinese student, the rest were all white Caucasian, yet the program was set up for the black minorities in the community. Now, I hate to use the word black, it's a cultural thing.
Sure.
And one of the issues is getting people to feel comfortable in society,
Safe.
comfortable to show up.
Yeah.
And sometimes by talking the black and white thing, we make it uncomfortable for them to show
Yeah,
up,
absolutely.
even though they have all the knowledge, skills, capabilities, and so forth.
Debbie Irving shares some examples in her book about that, where
I might-
all the best ideas in the world, and yet the wrong people were showing up, and it's like they started with the wrong questions, I think, along the way. You're only going to get about 10 more seconds, right?
Okay,
Sorry.
one example in our community, which I think is very significant and probably not well understood, Dr. Dolman, who was here a few years ago as a superintendent, grew up in Haiti. Haitians, I would suspect, based on my experience with my daughter teaching on St. John, do not consider themselves to be black Americans. They're West Indians.
Yeah.
So he came and he received his PhD from Connecticut. First off, he's West Indian, not African American. Gets his PhD in Connecticut and then has a job in Rochester, Minnesota, amongst the Scandinavians and Germans. What a cultural challenge he had.
Absolutely.
I had a great relationship, but many people had a problem.
Yeah. Thank you. We need to not finished today. But I think this is the conversation that's worth continuing, I really do. I want to applaud you for going down this road. There's a lot more we should talk about, need to talk about, following up on today. So thank you for coming. We will continue the conversation whenever they let me back into forums. So bless you.